the integrated vegetation management for resilient lands environmental assessment overview that the BLM just completed. I know there are some of you on here with private lands, and this maybe some of the concepts apply to your oak woodlands, and KSON has lots of other resources, but hopefully you'll find this interesting, what the BLM is proposing to do on BLM lands. So I'm just gonna give an overview of the EA and the kind of background need for the project, and then a little bit of details about the selected alternative, and then the project process for projects that will be initiated under the EA, and then some upcoming projects. And there are several other BLM team members on the project. So I was the lead for this project, but Jared Nickel, when he was our district planner, was originally on the project as well. And Lisa Meredith was the silviculturist on the project, and Fletcher came in at the end as the botanist. So lots of representation here. Maybe they can help me out with some questions if you have some. So this project just, builds on years of collaboration and learning, a lot of that with many of you on the call. Kind of think it started in 2010 with a big forest symposium that we had here locally. And then lots of monitoring that's been going on over the past decade. An Applegate Fuels demonstration project on Forest Service and BLM. We had another joint fire science riparian fuels treatment study in the Applegate. Of course, the Rogue Basin strategy and the wildfire risk assessment there, the Rogue Valley Integrated Fire Plan, lots of the work at Table Rock, all of the restoration work we've done and monitoring among partners here on this call. And let's see, the Klamath-Siskiyou Strategic Action Plan for Oak Conservation informed the project as well. Lots of fuels treatment effectiveness monitoring. Several of us went on a field trip a few months ago to look at some results in an oak woodland in the South Oban Chain Fire. And then we had a similar project in 2012, a programmatic IVM-EA, which most of the work at Table Rock happened under. And so this project is some adaptive management from things we learned from that programmatic EA. So just to get into the need a little bit more, in 2016, Southwest Oregon Resource Management Plan came into effect for the BLM, and it directs hazardous fuels reduction consistent with the National Cohesive Wildfire Strategy, which tries to create resilient landscapes, fire-adapted communities, and support coordinated wildfire response. And then some other relevant management direction in the resource management plan is to, remove competing conifers and add prescribed fire to support the persistence and resilience of native plant communities, and to conduct commercial thinning or group selection harvest on 17,000 acres per decade in late successional reserves to help those forests respond positively to climate-driven stresses and contribute to NSO habitat development. And a lot of this direction comes from the extensive effect that fire exclusion has had in Southwest Oregon, removing that natural disturbance from our land. So another need that this project is responsive to is the need for wildfire risk reduction. Some of you may know that there was recent analysis that identified 50 communities in Oregon with the highest cumulative wildfire risk, and 22 of these are in Southwest Oregon. The Rogue Valley Integrated Fire Plan calls for similar wildfire risk reduction needs, and as again does the BLM Resource Management Plan. Reduce wildfire risk, especially around highly valued resources and assets. There was also some recent research, it's about 5 years old now, of an evaluation of dry forests in Oregon and Washington that indicates that 51% of forests in Southwest Oregon are overly dense, and there's a need for restoration via fire and thinning. So this is, you can see here on the map that the greatest need on the map is in Southwest Oregon. Red is the highest need for thinning, restoration, and introduction of fire. So the same evaluation found that our landscape has an overabundance of homogeneous dense forests, all kind of similar structure, and most of this is in this mid-seral closed state. And this graphic here shows the current distribution of forest structure in the blue bars, and then this kind of reference condition that we expect from a frequent, naturally operating frequent fire system are in the green blocks. And you can see that our forests in Southwest Oregon are severely lacking that late seral open condition. And this photo here kind of indicates that, right? There's this very nice large ponderosa pine, and it's being encroached by several smaller Douglas fir that have been allowed to grow in because of fire exclusion. So, you know, the thinning need is to help distribute this sort of natural range of variability that we would expect to be resilient within a frequent fire system. The IVM EA is also responsive to the need identified by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the recovery plan for the northern spotted owl. They outlined that there's a need for active management in the frequent fire dry forests to promote resilient forests and support northern spotted owl habitat persistence and contribute to the recovery of the species. And then many of you are likely familiar with the Rogue Basin strategy, which was concurrently developed with our Southwest Oregon Resource Management Plan that I mentioned at the very beginning. And our dry land use allocations in the Southwest Oregon Resource Management Plan kind of encompass the bookend prescriptions of the Rogue Basin strategy, which was a vision for creating resilience for landscapes and fire adapted communities, and has you know, these 5 objectives here that it seeks to achieve, and prescribes suggests an increase of the pace and scale of proactive treatments. And then most recently, many of you are familiar with the KSON Strategic Action Plan for Oak Conservation, which identified fire exclusion and conifer encroachment as 2 of the top threats to oak systems. And the primary strategies to address those are reintroduction of prescribed fire and thinning of conifers. And then I heard someone mention how nice the rain is, and it is. As many of you know, in Josephine and Jackson County, we've been in prolonged extended drought periods. Here are some graphs from the US Drought Monitor of each county since 2000. You can see, you know, there's a lot of drought periods punctuated across that timeline, but since 2012, we've been in this extended period of some level of drought with maybe a 1-year reprieve. So the EA is also responsive to that situation. So all that background need prompted us to establish the purpose and need here for this program of work, driven primarily by management direction from the resource management plan. And then we analyzed 3 action alternatives and a no action alternative to address these purposes. So the purpose of the project is to promote and develop safe and effective wildfire response opportunities and reduce wildfire risk to highly valued resources and assets. And that can be, communities at risk, northern spotted owl habitat, special plant habitat, anything that we value as a resource. And then to promote and develop fire and disturbance resilient lands and fire resistant stands so that when fire visits our landscape, forests and woodlands will be able to persist and thrive through that disturbance event rather than high severity fire everywhere. And then to promote and develop habitat for special status species and unique native plant communities. And you can see the photos here. The top left photo is of a wildfire from 2018 where fuels reduction had been implemented before the fire, and firefighters were able to dig hand line in response to the fire. And it was during the lightning bust of 2018 that started several other fires that grew to large size. So you might remember the Taylor Creek fire, the Snowshoe fire, or the Miles fire. But this fire had such moderated fire behavior that firefighters were able to engage it and safely contain it. And then the photo on the top right, of course, the northern spotted owl, one of our threatened and endangered species, and then the Fritillaria generi, another threatened and endangered species we're managing for. And then the bottom right photo is of a prescribed fire in an oak woodland. So during the development of the IVM-EA, we had several public involvement phases and opportunities. We started the project with public scoping in July of 2019, and we got about 41 letters. And then, we continued to develop preliminary alternatives based on the need and some of the feedback from scoping. And then we released preliminary chapters 1 and 2, which is the purpose and need and the description of alternatives in the fall of 2019. And we had some meetings with that rollout in the Applegate in Williams, and then we had an open house at the Jackson County Expo and received some more letters. And then based on that public involvement and comments we received, we completed the EA and held a public webinar with that rollout of the EA, and then got quite a bit more feedback. So we've received more letters from the public about the EA that we released. And then, so we incorporated that. I have a slide later about more of the public involvement. And then we just released the final EA and decision record for the selected alternative in March. So all of the project documents are posted on our national BLM planning site, ePlanning. And then we have an IVM specific website that we created too. So these are the links to those. Just a little bit more about kind of some highlights of how we incorporated public comment. and participation. Initially we were thinking of including the Cascades-Siskiyou National Monument in this process, but it was excluded, as were any commercial actions in the harvest land base. And when we released chapters 1 and 2, we had 4 alternatives, and we revised those for the final EA to include three different than were in the original chapter 1 and 2. We dropped from consideration the removal of dead trees in the project. The selected alternative only includes temporary road construction, and the selected alternative provides the greatest opportunity for BLM to contribute towards all lands treatments and meet neighbors at the fence. And then the BLM committed to future public involvement on all projects, including commercial harvest. So those are some of the highlights, the short list of how we incorporated public feedback through the process. And then as far as future projects under IVM, the way this will work is it's a programmatic NEPA process. This Integrated Vegetation Management for Resilient Lands environmental assessment. So it itself doesn't authorize actions on the ground. It outlines a program of work that future projects would follow. And so programmatic NEPA does the analysis of environmental impacts, which we completed with the EA, and a programmatic decision was released on March 2nd, 2022, and I'll get into more details about that decision. And then site-specific projects will be developed, and this can take several years to complete. And then the BLM will evaluate those projects to determine their consistency with the IVM decision and EA. And then if the BLM determines consistency, a decision record is signed and posted to e-planning. If through that determination of NEPA adequacy process, the BLM might decide that, in fact, the project they want to do would require separate NEPA review and its own environmental analysis, or the project can be changed. So, and then as I said earlier, the public involvement process for future projects would be that every project with commercial actions, there will be an involvement opportunity, and then BLM field managers may decide to engage in additional public involvement for other actions under the project. And now you might be wondering, what are those actions under the project? So generally, the IVM EA authorizes vegetation thinning of trees and shrubs of all sizes, and prescribed fire, hand pile burning, and underburning, and then also construction of protection structures for special status plant species. So that could include fences, boulders, boardwalks. And projects would be implemented through a variety of mechanisms, primarily contracts and/or agreements. And so where could these future actions happen? The colors in this map are maybe a little bit challenging to discern, but as I said before, there's no actions authorized in the Cascades-Siskiyou National Monument, in wild and scenic rivers, or in our congressionally reserved land use allocations. And all these areas are brown on the map. So some of you probably are familiar with the monument and can pick out that area on the map. South, east of Ashland. And then small diameter thinning and prescribed fire are authorized across the entire IVM treatment area. So that's represented by the pink and the green areas on the map. There are some green areas to the far east in the checkerboard, and I guess that might help distinguish that color from the brown areas. And then commercial thinning and selection harvest are only authorized in the pink areas on the map. Those are locally reserved land use allocations, not congressionally reserved land use allocations. So specifically, the decision record for the selected alternative was signed on March 2nd. And as I said before, it in itself doesn't authorize specific ground or vegetation disturbing actions. Future projects will sign their own decision record to authorize those actions, but it authorizes this program of work to be performed over a 10-year period. And so you can see in this table here, there's maximum annual implementation acres and then 10-year maximum implementation acres, and then percentages correlated to this IVM treatment area, which is all of the pink and green on this map here. So the project authorizes 70,000 acres of prescribed fire over 10 years, 60,000 acres of small diameter thinning, and 20,000 acres of commercial thinning and selection harvest, and up to 90 miles of temporary road construction. So just in context, the prescribed fire, those 70,000 acres would be about 10% of that pink and green area on the map, whereas the commercial thinning and selection harvest is almost 3% of the entire treatment area. So just a little bit more detail on the thinning prescriptions. This is high level. You can go to the EA. Appendix 1 has many more project details, but in general, the commercial thinning prescriptive constraints, the project doesn't propose any regeneration harvest. There will be no incidental take of northern spotted owl. Northern spotted owl nesting roosting habitat will be maintained, and older structurally complex forest would be protected. And then there's no treatment of the best nesting roosting habitat for NSO. So that's those old stands that are in low landscape positions where they have a high likelihood of persisting into the future. There's no treatment in those areas. And then the rest of the commercial prescriptive constraints vary by the ability to develop high quality northern spotted owl nesting roosting habitat. So for example, maybe a young plantation on a north slope in a cool, moist aspect, that would be maybe a good place to think about developing northern spotted owl nesting roosting habitat. And then prescriptions vary by proximity to communities, and then vegetation type and topographic position. And this line really, this alternative thought a lot about the Rogue Basin strategy and the prescriptions that it outlines for forests. And then small diameter thinning would generally remove trees and shrubs less than 8 inches diameter, but could go up to 12 inches diameter. And that's across all of the treatment area. So that does include our harvest land base as well. And then spacing and species preference would depend on site conditions. And then as far as non-conifer thinning, which is what this group cares about the most, would be to retain and promote healthy and vigorous large oaks and pine, and then shrubs to reduce continuous horizontal fuel profiles in areas that pose a fire hazard to homes, communities, or that are adjacent to large oaks and pine. And then also, retain a portion of vegetation in variable sized skips where there wouldn't be treatments if there's not a fire hazard to homes or communities. So that balance between restoration and protection. Just a little more detail on the tools in the EA to promote heterogeneity. There's large tree culturing, so that's thinning around those large legacy trees. These photos are an example of before thinning and after thinning. Obviously not the same tree, just example photos of thinning around large pine. And then, you know, we also, the selected alternative also creates skips and openings of variable size. And these are, of course, important to create growing space to regenerate future fire-adapted species, disrupt fuel profiles, and create variability in litter fall. And then decrease competition. So creating heterogeneity is a big part of the project as well. And here's an example of the of an opening, a group selection opening that's regenerating a new cohort of trees. So to give you a visual of what that looks like. And then this is kind of an idealized visual of these vegetation and topography landscape concepts that the EA is seeking to support, is recoupling our vegetation patterns with the landscape. So you've got, you know, your warmer aspect with wider spaced trees, large trees, some understory, and in your cooler, moisture aspect, that's where there's higher densities, different species. So, as far as future projects that are being considered under this EA, the Grants Pass field office is planning a project called Late Mungers, and they have public involvement opportunities coming up in May, including a webinar on May 10th, and then a field trip on May 14th, and an opportunity to comment on the draft determination of NEPA adequacy. And then the Ashland field office is considering maintenance of some of their Applegate fuels reduction treatments that occurred in the early to mid 2000s and are due for maintenance prescribed fire. And then they may be considering an LSR project in the Middle Applegate as well. And then of course, if a future project linked to the Little Butte KSON OWEB initiative is a potential, but nothing's planned in that field office at this time. And then Butte Falls is considering continued restoration at Table Rock, but again, nothing's planned at this time. That is all I have. If anybody has any questions, thanks for the opportunity to present.